More than 3 decades have passed since Pretty Woman premiered in 1990, but the appeal of this modern-day Cinderella story remains intact in the memories of many of us. When mentioning the film, we immediately remember the radiant and free-spirited smile of Julia Roberts, the elegance of Richard Gere, and the immortal soundtrack echoing on the shopping streets of Rodeo Drive. For our generation, that work is not just a theatrical movie, but a beautiful memory of a bygone era. However, there are hidden corners behind the camera that Hollywood cleverly kept secret. You might not know that the original script was actually a very dark and tragic story, completely opposite to the happy ending we watched. In this video today, we will turn the pages of old documents together to discover 15 behind-the-scenes secrets and impromptu accidents that accidentally shaped this classic work. From actors who were almost rejected to legendary scenes created from unintended incidents, let us look back at Pretty Woman to see that, sometimes, imperfection accidentally creates a legend. The original ending was incredibly harsh. Perhaps the most iconic thing about Pretty Woman is the moment Edward held a bouquet of flowers, climbing up the fire escape to rescue Vivian like a prince stepping out of a modern fairy tale. That is the movie scene that has made millions of American viewers smile for over 3 decades. But the amazing thing is, that classic scene almost never existed. In the first script version, Edward absolutely did not come back for love. After ending the agreement, he just coldly threw money at Vivian, dropped her off in a rundown neighborhood, and drove the Lotus away in silence. No promises, no kiss, no happy ending. And the reaction of the test audience at that time almost exploded. Many people said they felt betrayed. After nearly 2 hours of watching the relationship between the two characters develop bit by bit, they could not accept Vivian being left behind like an item that had just lost its use value. The auditorium back then was described as extremely heavy and disappointed. That very moment changed Hollywood history. The studio understood that audiences did not just want to watch a realistic story. They wanted hope. They wanted magic. And so the director and the crew had to quickly reshoot a completely new ending, the ending that turned Pretty Woman into a romantic legend of the 90s. R. The sidewalk coat that cost a mere $30. The interesting thing about Pretty Woman is that the movie always knows how to mix the luxury of Hollywood with very relatable everyday details. And there is no item that shows that more clearly than the legendary oversized red coat of Vivian. Just by seeing that coat, audiences instantly remember the image of the curly-haired girl standing on the Los Angeles sidewalk with high boots and a smile that is both strong and fragile. It almost became a pop culture icon of the 90s. But what few people know is that iconic item was incredibly cheap. According to many behind-the-scenes stories, the wardrobe team bought that coat completely by chance from a theater usher for only about $30. It was not a designer brand. Not an exclusive design. Not from a luxury showroom. And perhaps that is exactly why it looked so real. Hollywood at that time still maintained a very special kind of spontaneity. Sometimes, the most expensive items do not leave as strong of an impression as an old coat hastily bought on the street. It made Vivian not look like a perfectly styled character, but rather a real person trying to survive in a massive city. That is also the reason the audience loves this character so much. Underneath the glamorous dresses later on, Vivian is still always the girl in that old red coat, authentic, clumsy, and full of life. Sen. The actress was so pressured that a blue vein popped on her forehead. Today, when watching Pretty Woman again, many people easily forget that at the time of filming, Julia Roberts was only a young 22-year-old actress, almost still taking her first steps into Hollywood. And behind the radiant smile that enchanted all of America that year was a massive pressure that she had to silently endure. According to many behind-the-scenes stories, during intimate scenes with Richard Gere, Julia Roberts was so tense that a large blue vein clearly stood out on her forehead. Not because her co-star was unpleasant or the set was toxic, but simply because she was too young, suddenly placed at the center of a major Hollywood project with dozens of people watching her every expression. The atmosphere at that time was recounted as quite touching. Director Gary Marshall and Richard Gere had to temporarily stop filming to help Julia relax. They walked over to the bed, spoke softly, and even massaged her forehead to relieve the tension before continuing the scene. It sounds very small, but it is the kind of story that makes people remember because it reflects a Hollywood completely different from today. Warmer, slower, and sometimes more like a family than a giant filmmaking machine. Perhaps it was also that very real fragility that made Vivian. The audience did not just see a character in the movie, they saw a young girl trying to overcome her own insecurities right in front of the Hollywood lens. Sue. Julia Roberts was once a replacement. Today, it is hard to imagine anyone else but Julia Roberts in the role of Vivian. That smile, that curly hair, and that energy, which is both clumsy and captivating, have almost become one with Hollywood history. But the unbelievable thing is that before Pretty Woman started filming, many big stars had rejected this role. Meg Ryan did not take the role. Michelle Pfeiffer also refused. And Daryl Hannah even criticized the script quite harshly because she thought the movie was romanticizing and degrading women. At that time, no one was truly sure that Pretty Woman would succeed. Even to many in the industry, this was just a weird project with controversial content. And then while a series of big names walked away, an almost unknown young actress appeared. Julia Roberts at that time was not yet a superstar. She was just a 22-year-old girl with a big smile and a naturalness that was hard to explain in words. But that very thing changed everything. She did not turn Vivian into a perfect model. She made the character lively, vulnerable, and full of emotion like a real human being. And then the magic happened. The movie exploded beyond imagination. Julia Roberts went from a young face in Hollywood straight to the ranks of a global star almost overnight. That is also the kind of story that America always loves the most, when the most underestimated person becomes the brightest star. Woo. The original script was a dark tragedy. The thing that shocks many viewers the most about Pretty Woman is that the movie we remember as a sweet Hollywood fairy tale was initially written as a haunting tragedy. In the first version, the movie had a very cold title, 3000. That was not a symbol of love, but simply the transaction amount between Edward and Vivian. There were no happy tunes. There was no radiant smile on Rodeo Drive. And there certainly was no Disney-style happy ending that the whole world once loved. The original script delved deep into the dark side of Los Angeles in the late 80s, a place full of drugs, loneliness, and people trying to survive day by day. The character Vivian was originally a heavy drug addict, while Edward was cold and almost emotionless. Instead of a healing romance, the story back then was like a sad slice of life about lost people in a glamorous city. And the most memorable thing is, the original ending was extremely cruel. Edward left, threw money at Vivian, and abandoned her on the street, completely without the famous stair-climbing scene later on. It sounds hard to believe, right? The movie that once made millions of Americans dream about love almost became one of the gloomiest Hollywood movies of the early 90s. Leo? The snapping of the jewelry box lid was a prank. If there is any moment in Pretty Woman that makes audiences remember forever for over 30 years, then that is definitely the laugh of Vivian when Edward suddenly snapped the jewelry box shut right in front of her hands. That is a very rare kind of moment in cinema. Not complicated. No need for grand dialogue. But it is so authentic that it makes the whole scene light up. And the most wonderful thing is, all of it was completely off script. While shooting the famous diamond necklace scene, Richard Gere suddenly had the idea to tease his co-star. When Julia Roberts was reaching out to touch the jewelry, he immediately shut the box hard, making her startle and burst into laughter. That reaction was completely natural. It was not acting. It was not rehearsed beforehand. It was just a spontaneous moment between two actors who were truly feeling comfortable with each other on set. And that very thing created the magic that the audience can feel even through the screen. The director loved that moment so much that he decided to keep it exactly as it was in the final cut. Even over time, it has become one of the most famous scenes in Hollywood romance film history. Perhaps that is also the special thing about 90s cinema. Sometimes the most memorable moments do not come from visual effects or expensive shots, but from a real laugh, unexpected, and full of life, between two people in front of the camera. See. The huge continuity error in the breakfast scene. Even a beloved movie like Pretty Woman could not escape extremely interesting behind-the-scenes goofs. And this is probably the mistake that longtime fans like to point out the most. In a breakfast scene between Edward and Vivian at the luxury hotel, Vivian was initially holding a croissant, a true classic European-style breakfast. Everything was completely normal until the camera changed angles. Suddenly, the croissant disappeared. Instead, Vivian was holding a half-eaten pancake as if it had just teleported in just one short second. This is a classic continuity error in cinema, meaning a lack of continuity between different camera angles. This often happens because movies are not shot in chronological order. Sometimes a morning scene is shot today, but the close-up angle is shot a few days later. And amidst the packed shooting schedule, sometimes no one notices that the pastry in the hands of the actor has changed shape. The interesting thing is that small mistakes like that actually make the audience love the movie more in a very special way. It reminds everyone that behind the glamour of Hollywood, there are still busy film crews, long shooting days, and very human mistakes. Perhaps that is also the unique charm of 90s movies. Back then, there was no perfect computer-generated imagery or artificial intelligence to fix every frame. Everything felt more real, and sometimes those tiny goofs made the movie more memorable than ever. The opera La Traviata was not chosen by chance. One of the most subtle details of Pretty Woman is something that many young viewers today might accidentally miss. That is the night Edward took Vivian to the opera house to watch La Traviata. At first glance, this just seems like a luxurious scene meant to show Vivian stepping into the extravagant upper-class world. But actually, the crew chose this opera extremely intentionally. La Traviata tells the story of a courtesan who falls in love with a wealthy man, a beautiful but tragic romance full of social barriers. Sounds familiar, right? That is almost a direct mirror reflecting the fate of Vivian. The special thing is that Vivian initially did not fully understand the content of the play, but she was still so moved that she burst into tears. And that moment speaks volumes. Sometimes people do not need to fully understand the language or cultural layers to feel a sincere love story. Early 90s Hollywood really liked these kinds of metaphorical layers. They did not speak directly to the audience. They let the music, the gazes, and the very small choices in the setting tell the story themselves. And perhaps that is the reason Pretty Woman still lives forever. The movie is not just a modern fairy tale. It is also a very interesting dialogue between the working-class world and classical art, where a girl from Hollywood Boulevard can still cry over opera just like anyone else. So, the rejection drama on Rodeo Drive was a true story. One of the most satisfying scenes for viewers in Pretty Woman was when Vivian returned to the luxury fashion store with piles of shopping bags in her hands and said the legendary line, "Big mistake, huge." That moment was not merely a sweet retaliation. It also carried a very real feeling. And the reason behind it is even more interesting than many people think. In real life, quite a few actual luxury stores on Rodeo Drive refused to let the film crew shoot. In the late 80s, many high-end brands were extremely worried about being associated with a movie whose main character was a prostitute. To them, that could affect the luxurious image they had worked hard to build. In other words, Hollywood at that time was facing the exact same judgment that Vivian had to endure in the movie. This unintentionally made the movie much more authentic. The feeling of being looked at with contempt, being judged only by appearance, was exactly the experience that many Americans at that time sympathized with, even if they had never set foot on Rodeo Drive. And perhaps that is the reason that scene lives on for generations. Because deep down, Pretty Woman is not just about love. It is also about the feeling of wanting to be recognized, wanting to be treated like a valuable human being, regardless of where you come from. Sure, the $250,000 necklace and the armed security guard. There is a scene in Pretty Woman that audiences still remember to this day. The moment Vivian was amazed when the sparkling diamond necklace was opened before her eyes in the luxurious hotel room. The soft lighting, the smile of Edward, and the very real astonishment of Julia Roberts. But what many people do not know is that necklace was completely real. The piece of jewelry was borrowed from a high-end jewelry store with a value of about $250,000, a huge number in 1990. The producers clearly understood they were placing a whole fortune right in the middle of the set. So during the entire filming process, there was always an armed security guard standing right behind the camera to keep an eye on the item. It sounds more like a detail in a detective movie than behind the scenes of a romance film, right? And perhaps that is exactly why the emotion in that scene became strangely authentic. The look in the eyes of Julia Roberts was not entirely acting. That was truly the reaction of a young woman standing before a piece of jewelry that most people could only see through a store glass window. An even more interesting thing is, the moment Edward suddenly snapped the box shut on the hands of Vivian, making her burst into laughter, was originally not in the script at all. Richard Gere was just joking spontaneously on set, but that natural laugh became one of the most adorable and famous moments of the entire movie. Shri. The hearty laugh had to be traded for a tickling prank. One of the cutest and most natural scenes of Pretty Woman comes from an extremely funny behind-the-scenes secret. That is the scene where Vivian is lying on the floor of the luxurious penthouse, snacking and watching a comedy show on TV, then laughing hysterically like a carefree child. That moment is very small, but it makes the character of Julia Roberts become strangely relatable. She is no longer the girl standing on the corner of Hollywood Boulevard. She is just a young woman enjoying the simplest feeling of happiness in life. But the interesting thing is, Julia Roberts initially could not act out the uncontrollable kind of laugh that the director wanted. She could laugh, but it was not natural enough. It did not have enough of the feeling of someone who was truly forgetting all the pressure around them. And then director Gary Marshall came up with a very Gary Marshall method. He quietly hid outside the frame and started tickling the feet of Julia Roberts while the camera was still rolling. The result was that the actress laughed for real, almost unable to control her reaction. The best thing is that the scene ultimately brought the exact spirit that the movie needed: light, warm, and full of life. Perhaps that is also the reason the American audience loves Pretty Woman so much. The movie does not just show people the glamour of Beverly Hills, but also reminds everyone that sometimes happiness is simply being able to laugh genuinely, without needing to put up a guard. Sure. The spectacular deception on the movie poster. Perhaps millions of viewers have seen the legendary poster of Pretty Woman without realizing it contains one of the most famous deceptions in Hollywood. That is the image of Vivian leaning against Edward with a mischievous smile and outstanding long legs, a picture that appeared across American movie theaters in the early 90s and became a pop culture icon for many years. But the truth is, the body in that poster does not completely belong to Julia Roberts. Hollywood at that time used the body of body double Shelley Michelle and then grafted the face of Julia Roberts onto it using photo editing techniques. If looking closely, many people only later realized that the body proportions and hair in the poster were slightly different from the Vivian that appeared in the movie. And it does not stop there. Richard Gere in real life is famous for his elegant salt and pepper hair. But on the poster, that hair was edited into a very Hollywood glossy black, as if someone wanted to turn him into the perfect gentleman model, according to the romantic standards of that time. It sounds funny today, but that was exactly the Hollywood of the 90s. A place where everything was polished to create the most beautiful dream possible. And the interesting thing is that even though that poster was not entirely real, the audience still loved it with all their hearts. Perhaps because in the end, what people remember forever is not the photo editing technique, but the warm feeling that the movie brought. Shasen. The lawyer Stuckey was once much more cruel and creepy. If watching Pretty Woman again today, many viewers will remember Stuckey as an annoying, rude, and toxically powerful villain. But few people know that his original version was much darker. In the original tragic script, Stuckey was not just a perverted lawyer who liked to bully Vivian. He was built as a symbol of the terrifying dark side of the Los Angeles wealthy class, cold, dangerous, and with almost no moral limits. Some initial scenes were written with an extremely tense atmosphere, feeling more like a psychological thriller than a romance movie. The crew later realized that if they kept that tone, the movie would become too heavy and make the audience lose the warm feeling they wanted to build for the romance between Edward and Vivian. Therefore, the character of Stuckey was significantly toned down before the official shooting day. Looking back, one can see that it was a very smart decision. Because Pretty Woman succeeded not because it denied the dark side of society, but because it knew when to stop to keep the audience hopeful. And perhaps that is also a very characteristic trait of early 90s Hollywood. Even when telling stories with many dark corners, they always tried to leave a ray of light at the end of the road, the thing that made the audience walk out of the theater feeling their hearts a little lighter. 是 the authentic piano melody in the quiet space. There is a very quiet scene in Pretty Woman that many cinema-loving audiences still remember to this day. That is when Edward sat alone by the piano in the luxury hotel lobby in the middle of the night. No loud dialogue. No intense background music. There was only soft lighting and lonely melodies echoing in the quiet space. What makes that scene even more special is that Richard Gere was truly playing the piano. No stunt double. No fake hands. No playback. Richard Gere had long had a passion for music, and the piece of music that appeared in the movie was spontaneously composed by him and played live right on the set. That very thing made the emotion in the scene become strangely authentic. The viewer got the feeling that Edward, for the first time, revealed the lonely human part that he always hid behind the cold exterior of a successful billionaire. That is also a very typical kind of moment in 90s movies. Slow, subtle, and without the need to explain everything with words. Today, Hollywood is often full of high-speed shots and intense music. But Pretty Woman dared to dedicate a few minutes just to let a man sit playing the piano quietly. And strangely enough, those very quiet minutes are what make the audience remember forever over dozens of years. Perhaps because sometimes the most romantic thing is not flowery words of love, but the moment someone unintentionally lets you see their truest soul. 失误, the fateful note that saved the whole project. There are moments in Hollywood that sound exactly like a movie scene rather than real life. And the story behind Pretty Woman is an exact example of that. Before accepting the role of Edward, Richard Gere was very hesitant. He felt this character was too cold and lacked emotional depth. For an actor who likes introspective roles like Richard Gere, Edward at that time seemed to be just a wealthy but rather dry businessman. According to many behind-the-scenes stories, while Richard Gere was sitting on the phone preparing to turn down the role, Julia Roberts quietly wrote a few words on a small notepaper and pushed it towards him. Those words were simply, "Please say yes." It sounds small, but that moment ultimately changed the entire history of Hollywood romantic cinema. Richard Gere smiled, changed his mind, and decided to join the movie. And the rest almost became a legend. What makes this story live on is not just because of the popularity of the movie, but because it carries the exact spirit of Pretty Woman. Sometimes the things that change a life do not come from grand decisions, but from a very sincere moment between two people. A small piece of paper, a gentle request. And then millions of audiences around the world got one of the most iconic couples in American romantic film history. Ladies and gentlemen, looking back at these beautiful secrets and accidents, we finally understand why Pretty Woman still holds a special place in the hearts of the audience for more than 3 decades. Sometimes, the truest cinematic magic comes from the very moments that were never predetermined in the script. We would love to hear from you. Please tell us which surprise impressed you the most today, or if you have any special memories from when you first watched this movie in the 90s. Please share your story in the comment section below. Do not forget to like and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to relive these priceless cinematic memories together. Thank you, and see you next time.